Our guest today has won two majors, 14 career titles, was ranked in the top 20 for 6 years, made quarterfinal the better of all majors, was part of the original golden era of tennis, and competed toe to toe with the likes of Johnny Mack, Jimmy Connors, Ivan Lendl, Mats Wilander, and Boris Becker, and many more. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Johan Kriek. So, Johan, thanks for taking time out to join us at Tennis with an Accent.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me on.
The first question is just because we have, I'm sure, also some young listening base, and you are a legend of the game. You won 2 Australian Open. Just share with our audience, how did this tennis journey start with you back in South Africa?
Oh, well, my wife, if she was here, she goes, "You asked him the wrong question. You'll be here till 10 o'clock tonight." Easy. Now, I grew up on a sugar plantation on the Indian Ocean, not far from Durban. And funny enough, fantastic Indian food in Durban because we have a large Indian population. So I'm a big fan of Indian cuisine. So I grew up on a farm, and my parents played a little bit of tennis, and my dad was a great athlete. My mom was pretty active, and we grew up on a farm, and we had our typical life on a farm. And I grew up in a very small town that only had like 2 tennis courts at the time, and so it was just the love of the game. I started when I was 4 years old. My parents introduced me to tennis. They were just normal club players, and then when I was around 10 years old, I was pretty good, and my grandparents took me to a tournament, and I won it. And we lived in a caravan park, and we had a collapsible caravan tent in a place called Nelspruit, which is actually where Cliff Drysdale is from. And I won my first tournament that I ever played, and got a big trophy. And I thought that was pretty cool. And sort of the bug started at a very young age, and then I got discovered, and I went to Pretoria. My parents got me into a fantastic high school, and that was very competitive in sports and academics. It's kind of like going to Choate or Exeter or something like that. And so I was a good student, but I was much more athletic minded, and I had the Wanderlust. I always wanted to see what's on the other side of the planet, and so that was a good combination. And I ended up my coach in South Africa emigrated to Europe when I was 15, and I was still in high school, and I didn't see him for 2 years. And his name is Ian Cunningham, and he went to Austria, and I followed him. 2 years later, I was 17 years old when I went to Europe. It was just a sheer luck that I ended up in Europe, and I played a lot on red clay for about 3 years. In 1978, I came to the U.S., and I played my satellite tour in Florida. And I got my butt beat so badly in the first 3 weeks, I told my dad that he might have to make some room. I'm going to come back and farm. I stuck it out and made a bit of money to keep going through the spring and the summer. And by the summer U.S. Open in 1978 was the first year they had it at Flushing Meadows, and they transitioned from Forest Hills. I qualified, and I got all the way to the quarterfinals, and I was discovered. And that's when it all started for me.
That's a wonderful story. So you grew up during the apartheid. Was it a challenge for you to participate in international tournaments coming out of South Africa?
Yes and no. They were obviously there was some. When I went to boarding school, and when you're in a boarding school situation, you're not free to roam the streets. You're kind of solid into this schoolwork and everything. So I really didn't know much about the political craziness that was going on outside of our mainstream South African mindset. So it was only when I arrived in Austria that I realized that people hate me because where I'm from. And I'm like, how can you dislike me when you don't know me? So that was the beginning of understanding the world of politics, which is so crazy. And as we see today, it's even crazier perhaps. But it was tough sometimes when apartheid was at the height of its, I would say at the height of anti-political issues for South African athletes. I was one of them. It was a lightning rod for a lot of people. And I had death threats not only from my own country, because I became a U.S. citizen in 82, but I also got death threats from people here. So it was kind of a crazy situation.
Wow.
Like damned if you do and damned if you don't. But I stuck it out, and I always went back to South Africa. I have a lot of friends and family there, and played the tournament. What most people don't realize is that the South African Open back in the 70s and 60s and even up to the 80s was the 5th oldest tournament after the Grand Slam tournament. And it was a very important tournament back in the day with the Rod Lavers of the world and the Rosewalls and those Aussies and some of the older Americans. And the political things, I unfortunately fell right into that 15-year slot where we were not allowed to play Davis Cup. We're not allowed to enter any international competitions. So it was not really tough, but it was kind of sad that I never played Davis Cup because I would have loved to play with Kevin Curran or some of the other guys.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up Davis Cup because obviously we're from India and India's only made the final a couple of times. And one time was in 1974.
Exactly. South Africa got the walkover.
Yes. So, I think after that it was a difficult period for about 4 or 5 years for anyone from South Africa to get into the mainstream. It seemed that way.
Exactly. But I have an even funnier story. So 1974, I was in high school. And I remember that specific time because it was such an exciting time for South Africa to get to Davis Cup finals. And then, obviously India didn't come, so it was an automatic walkover. But, nobody wants to win like that. But anyway, I became one of the top Americans because I became a U.S. citizen in '82. I was married at the time to an American gal. And I was number 7 in the world, and I was the 3rd or 4th best American. And after McEnroe and Connors. And so Arthur Ashe called me one time. I didn't really know Arthur, but I played against him maybe once or twice towards the end of his career. And I only knew him from the tour, but not really well. And so obviously he became Davis Cup captain at that time. And, Connors and McEnroe were the top guys. And he asked me if I am ready to play Davis Cup. And I was very excited because it was such an honor. I mean, I couldn't believe that I have made it from a farm boy in South Africa to become a Davis Cup player for the U.S. And I told him I was very, very, very flattered and I would be honored to play and I would be ready if he calls me. And the call to this day never came through. So I think something happened between him and I'm not going to name names, but I have a very good inkling who it was because at the time there were some major big domos and promoters that he was dealing with that has probably told him and said, Arthur, you're making a huge mistake. You're opening up a big can of worms with the political issues. Don't pick him. And so I got whammed again. Didn't matter whether I qualified or not. It was just all politics.
Yeah, and I'm sure at that time the U.S. Davis Cup team, we had some really good players right in the top 10 who were probably making it hard for you to begin with.
Yeah, no, but, what was interesting is that I was told by Arthur, okay, well, I'll wait and see what happens with the next tournament. And then I beat the 2 guys that went into the Davis Cup team in front of me. I beat both of them in that same tournament. So I kind of overqualified, overconfirmed, and yet they wouldn't pick me.
That's wonderful. So let's talk about your 2 big wins. So you won the Australian Open twice in '81 and '82, and it was played on grass back then.
Correct.
We wanted to ask you what made it. So what was the difference between the grass in Kooyong versus at Wimbledon?
Obviously we play in a much hotter climate in Melbourne. So the 2 years that I won it was extremely hot. And the grass courts were very dry and it was playing extremely fast. So I was very much in my element because I like fast courts. And so was McEnroe. And so, I did really well. And funny enough, I had to play Steve Denton in the finals, both finals. And the first year I beat him in 4 sets was much harder. And then the second year I was really on top of it and I beat him in straight sets. But
probably hates you, huh?
Funny enough, we are very good friends. I just saw him in November. We got on a ferry to be honored by the ATP for the O2 Arena. Owed it to the 80s guys that made it to the Masters tournament, which I made in singles and doubles. And so I saw Steve Denton on a ferry, and I did an interview with him on my phone. It was hilarious. I asked his friend out of the blue. I said, listen, man, just let the thing roll. I'm going to talk to Steve about what happened back 35, 40 years ago. It was so funny. And people absolutely loved the interview because it was completely off the cuff.
Okay, so let's make more of a segue into the early 80s. Same year, I think you won Australia. You ran into Johnny Mack at Wimbledon quarterfinals, who was probably at the peak of his powers. How were those matches? I know you scored 5 wins against him. How did you match up against Mack?
I actually didn't like to play him, and yet at the same time I liked to play him because he made you play really the best tennis of your capability because you have to deal with all the crap that goes on besides the tennis playing. So it's a test of wills, it's a test of patience, it's a test of not killing him. And so, but we actually have mutual respect for each other. I mean, he obviously didn't become number one because he was a bad tennis player. He became number one because he knew how to handle a racket. So back in those days, it was different tennis than they play today. And he was very much a serve and volleyer with amazing hands, amazing court skills, amazing movement. He was actually a much better athlete than what people realized. And because he didn't look like an athlete, really. But so did Connors, didn't look like an athlete, much of one, but he was amazing. So, I've always enjoyed playing him. Unfortunately, he knocked me off twice in the quarterfinals of Wimbledon when he won it the one year, and then he lost in the finals the next year. So, at least I lost to somebody that was pretty good. But I got him back a few times. I beat him in the finals in Memphis literally a few months after I won the Australian Open, and I thought I was playing the best tennis of my career at that time. And so here I played Johnny Mack, number one in the world, in the finals of the United States National Indoor title, and I beat him 6-4 in the third. So I knew that I was there with the big guys. And, I had an unbelievable career. I mean, if I have to think where I come from and how I made it, I mean, it's so very unlikely.
No, absolutely. I mean, 14 titles, 4 years in the qualifying for the ATP Tour World Finals, as is known now. I mean, yeah, it is hell of a career. So let me ask you one more thing about you guys were also part of a very unique era. Like we have a very successful golden era right now. You had many players with multiple major titles, like yourself. Then Lendl became, someone who went on to win 8 titles. Johnny Mack, Connors, Becker, Edberg were coming up. How was it to share locker room with these guys? Were there like huge egos? What is it like compared to the nice, Federer and Nadal?
There was no room big enough for those egos. I mean, not even a stadium could fit it. But it was an amazing era because, tennis back was played in the 50s and 40s and 60s with wood rackets. And we came along as when tennis was just starting to become very popular. And suddenly you have the super sweet Borg, who is super cold and never says boo on the court. And then you have crazy McEnroe, who was the polar opposite of him and played a completely different type of tennis. And then Jimmy Connors was there a little bit before Johnny Mack. Had all these other people that came along. I mean, there were so many unbelievably good players. But I think what that era of the 80s, maybe 70s into the 80s, maybe early 90s, was an era where, if you were a German, you grew up in Germany and you played German tennis and you came over to the world and you showed them that, I'm better than everybody. But nowadays it seems like you got Russian, Germans, and they all come out of Florida. It's just funny how that kind of changed. But it was an amazing era. I consider myself extremely lucky because there were so many vivid players. I mean, the Nastasis of the world were still around playing really great tennis. And you got Vilas and you got Borg and Connors and McEnroe and Jose Luis Clerc. You got Gomez from Ecuador. I mean, we were like such a rich history and then Wilander and Edberg. Who would have thought a Swede could serve and volley like that after, Borg and Wilander came along? Suddenly comes Edberg and he knocks everybody off. And Boris Becker came in and, superstar from Germany. And then Steffi Graf at the same time. I mean, it was an amazing era because it made tennis incredibly popular, especially in Europe. And then in 89, when the wall came down and the Russian Federation broke up, you have all these young, very hungry Eastern Europeans coming out, which to this day is basically ruling the roost.
Yeah, and
quite interesting to see.
I want to piggyback on the ego question. I mean, so we have somebody like Nick Kyrgios today, who's getting a lot of flack from the media. Do you feel like, what's your take on, how he's being handled right now, considering what we saw of Johnny Mack and the others back in the day?
Well, I mean, when Mack first came along, and, I played also in the era where Andre Agassi came out of the woodwork, so I played against Andre quite a few times, had some good success against him, also lost to him. But, tennis, I mean, in any sport, you have good guys, so to speak, good guys, and you got the bad guys. And it's all theater, it's all show business. So, look, I think that Kyrgios could be an amazing, amazing attraction for the sport as, quote, the bad boy of tennis. But he hasn't really won too much, and that's the big diff. I mean, McEnroe could open his mouth because he had won Grand Slams and he's won major titles. But it's kind of hard to take a guy that has a big mouth and a big ego when he hasn't really done much, And does he have talent? Absolutely. And I just think that he would bring a whole new dimension to tennis with a new group of fans. This sort of punk, funny haircut, kind of cocky attitude, sort of like a modern day Andre Agassi was. I think he would be good for tennis. But I mean, he needs to get some people behind him as a team that kind of understand him really well and don't try and put him in a box. But I don't know if those types of people can really have a team because, the way that the teams are set up now, if you look at the top guys, it's very simple. It looks very complicated, but it really isn't. They took a complicated situation and made it look easy. But a guy like Kyrgios and a guy like McEnroe, I think he's kind of a lone wolf. He's got to do his own thing. And I don't know if Kyrgios he's a supremely talented tennis player. But I don't know if he continues to do what he's doing and tanking and doing things differently. I think he may be a firecracker and go off too early and never show back up.
Yeah, we hope that doesn't happen.
Okay.
I truly hope so. I also hope that he doesn't go away because I think he's an interesting guy. I mean, he's super talented. I just hope that he can find a common ground to be himself, but yet be in the game the right way. He's not in the game the right way right now.
Okay, so I have a question, which I want to ask you because we are, the Boris Becker generation that we call in India. We caught fire with tennis with Becker winning Wimbledon. So there's a comment that I've heard so many times on TV and also in articles relating to Becker. I want to hear it from the horse's mouth. So is it true that when he beat you at the Queen's final, you walked after the match and told Jimmy Connors that if this kid can play like this, he's going to win Wimbledon, and Connors kind of just gave you the look? How is that story?
That's 100% true. First of all, when I played, I don't really look. Well, let me just backtrack a little bit. So 1985, was Becker's banner year, right? In 1984, I'm playing in the South African Open in November, December, something like that. And I'm walking to the tournament, and I hear, I lived in Austria at the time, so I speak German. And I hear this guy screaming at the top of his lung at this guy in German, saying every cuss word you can imagine in German. And I'm looking, and I'm like, who is this punk with a freckled face with the red hair going off at such a young age to some coach? I could hear everything perfectly clear what he was saying. He thought nobody could understand German. So I walked by there and I'm going, geez, I can't believe this guy. And it was Günter Bosch. Boris Becker was like 16 and a half years old or whatever. And they were having a nasty fight about practice on the court. So I'm like, what a jerk this kid is, Anyway, so forward 6 months. I'm playing Queens, and I really never look forward to who I play. I just, the day before I find out who I play, and I kind of recap in my mind what I've done and seen and whatever before, or whether I played them before. So this guy came up to me and he says, listen, I'm from the Daily Telegraph or something. I'm just wanting to know, how do you feel playing a German schoolboy? And I go, he's a German schoolboy? How old is he? And he says, he's 17. I go, and he's a German schoolboy? Yeah. And I say, what's his name? He says, Boris Becker. And so when I walk on the court, I see this kid that I saw 6 months ago, that this is the jerk kid that I saw in South Africa. And, I played him pretty tight in the first set. And I think it was like 6-4, 6-3 or 6-3, 6-3, something like that. He beat me. And he played out of his mind because I beat a couple of really good players. I think I beat Cash, Mayotte, and another guy from New Zealand, Russell Simpson, who was a really tough Croatian player.
Zivojinovic, right? You beat him too, from Yugoslavia?
Zivojinovic, yeah, big serving guy. And then I played Boris. And, I came off the court and I said to myself, I have never been served off the court like that by a right-hander, ever.
Yeah.
And I said to myself, I normally am a really good returner. I had no idea where he was serving, and he was serving line after line after line. Doesn't matter where he aimed, he hit the line. So he was on fire, and so the newspaper guy came to me afterwards. I'm in a press conference, and I just said, look, I mean, if a guy like that, if he serves like that, he'll win Wimbledon. Sure as heck he did.
It is. I mean, that became a projection.
I wonder what he would have done with that serve and with the rackets that we have today.
Well, I think, I think that that's a pretty good subject to discuss about what happened to the serve and volley game. And everybody has their theory. Oh, everybody hits the ball harder. I think that there's definitely a place for serve and volley. I think it's more of a opportunistic issue. It's not the pure serve and volley style. But there's no reason why a guy like a Isner could not serve and volley 90% of every serve he serves, because he serves so big. It's so tough to return his serve that I think if he had greater volley and movement skills, I think he could win a lot more titles, probably be much higher rank.
Don't you think the courts at the Australian Open this year, they helped a bit with Misha Zverev? I mean, it was nice to see Federer and Zverev play serve and volley tennis in the quarterfinals.
It's totally doable. I just think that, but this is a really hot subject. I think and I'm probably going to get a lot of hate mail for this one, but I just think that, look, it's the same type of mentality that happens when Bjorn Borg, when Jimmy Connors first burst on the scene in America. Let's just take Jimmy Connors for a second. Everybody had to have a T2000 Wilson racket. Yep. And those things are lying in mothballs. They never rust. It's a stainless steel thing. And it's still sitting in people's closets everywhere. So everybody wants to get part of it and wants to be part of it and wants to be part of it. And so when Borg came along, everybody says, well, I just got to hit from the baseline. Then comes McEnroe. Oh, look at that. Now everybody wants to serve and volley. It's kind of like sheep, And I unfortunately feel like in the modern day, coaches, too much sheep has gone under the bridge here. And they just follow the trend that it's more this, it's just not that. And I think that the serve and volley really was neglected. And I can understand that the guys hit the ball harder, faster, more dipping than ever before. But I still think that aspect of a serve and a volley game has to be practiced to be perfected, even if you use it maybe 10 times in a match. But so there's a big thing. And then I think there's guys that match up that you can serve and volley almost virtually every big first serve. So I think it's a part of tennis that has been neglected by sheep coaches in the modern age.
So let me ask you this: you have an academy now going, and I read an interview of yours. You said you said that the goal is to find the next Grand Slam champion. Are you promoting a serve and volley kind of style of tennis with your recruits?
Well, I think yes, and let me explain why. I think it's not because I'm an old timer that wants to think that you can race a Ferrari from 1975 against a modern day Ferrari. I don't think that's the case at all. But what I do say is that if people serve and volley now at the US Open or at the Australian Open, it's almost an anomaly, and people are like, "Oh, look at that! Isn't that unusual?" I'm like, man, did you guys ever see Patrick Rafter or Cash or Edberg or McEnroe or myself serve and volley? We had to have amazing skills with a racket that had a sweet spot the size of a ping pong ball, and we could still direct a volley. So I just think it's not being taught enough as a way to play, as an adjunct to your tennis. I look at people train today. It's just absolutely murdering the ball from the baseline, and the volley skills are just not there. So I teach my kids every single shot in the book. If they have to hit a half volley, they're going to have to learn how to hit it. If they want to swing volley, they're going to have to learn to hit that. So, it makes absolutely no sense to me as a tactic to hit massive ground strokes that puts another person in the corner, off the court, and you have no volley skills. I mean, that just to me makes zero sense.
That makes sense. And it's good to see Roger come back a little bit to that style. And as you said, he's being opportunistic, but it's great to see that he's actually playing a lot of serve and volley. And maybe there was an influence of having Edberg in his camp a couple of years back.
Well, I think absolutely. And I think that, Roger Federer is the ultimate all-court player. I don't think we're going to see anybody of his kind of caliber in our lifetime. But, he's an anomaly. And, he's so good and he's got such incredible hands and feel that he can do basically anything he wants to do. If he just wants to grind from the baseline when he was younger, he could do that. But now, if he wants to win, he played exactly the right way. And I think that Ljubicic has done a fantastic job at, I would say, polish off and augment what Paul Anacone did with him, what Stefan Edberg did with him. And I think Ljubicic had a big backhand for a big guy from Croatia. And I think he's a very smart tactician. And I think he has looked at the last number of matches where Roger played Nadal and realized that there was the same old, I would say, the wave that came that worked on Roger's backhand and just completely buried him later in the match. And then Roger couldn't muster up enough. He just didn't believe in that he could hit that ball that hard. And he completely showed us in this final match at the Australian Open this year that if there's a will and there's a belief system that you can actually do it. And he did it. I mean, he basically beat Nadal with his backhand. It was amazing to me because, as we remember, I mean, Nadal is 23-11 head-to-head. And Federer couldn't touch him the last couple of times they played. And, I mean, what Roger did was so amazing. And I have my theories about why he was so clean about everything he did and why he came back from 3-1 down in the fifth. I think the 6 months off has done him a world of good because if he had kept playing and he was in somewhat good shape, but say maybe he lost to he lost to Andy Murray in a tournament, he lost to Djokovic twice, or he lost to Nadal twice, 3 times, that baggage would have still been with him through January. And I think what happened was that he basically got his computer wiped clean and he didn't have that added pressure of worry of how good these guys are and just went out and played his own game. And that was a huge morale booster for him. He didn't have baggage in his mind about previous matches so much. He had forgotten about it.
I'm so glad that in your explanation you brought up Paul Anacone because I think for all the Federer coaches, a lot of time, again, all due respect to Edberg, but Anacone's, I think, contribution gets forgotten. I think he was, in your era, he's a guy who used to chip in charge. He would come in on a return. I think that mindset started with Anacone, and then you're right, it just carried over to full circle with Ljubicic. Can you talk about the Anacone style of tennis back in the 80s, which we don't see at all, chip and charge tennis?
Well, I knew I was in trouble because I heard I was playing somebody in the second round or third round at Wimbledon one year, and I was playing this guy Paul Anacone, and I heard he had won the NCAA championships. So I went in blind. I had no idea who this guy was, never heard of him, never saw him play, and he turned. I mean, I always serve first at grass courts, and so I won the toss, and I served a blistering serve down the middle of the box, and he was at the net before I was at the net. I just looked in disbelief and I thought, oh man, this is going to be a long day at the office. And he ended up beating me, and he did very well that year. I think he got to the quarterfinals. But yeah, he played with a big racket, and if you had any chance of a second serve, he would chip and charge you, and the ball was low, and he was very quick, and he had pretty darn good hands. And he was a fantastic singles player, but he ended up a better doubles player at the end of the day. But yeah, Paul's a good friend of mine. His brother works in the Hamptons. He's a nice guy, Steve Anacone. And so I know them pretty well. And they're very nice guys, very smart. And Paul was a very quiet operator. And he was a smart guy. But like anything else in any sport or any business, sometimes you need to be shaken up. And it's not that these coaches are suddenly bad. It's just that the relationship maybe is stale, and maybe there's just a feeling of, let me step aside because I want this athlete to become more excited maybe, or find somebody else to give him a better chance. Maybe there's just a talk, and just to hear the same message from a different person may make a difference. Because at these high levels, these guys play with 0.5% interest and they win. 0.5% less, they lose. That's how it goes.
Now, would you be up for coaching if the right offer came along and go back on the tour? I know you have your own academy.
Yes and no. I mean, I have a family I have a young family now. I've got a 6-year-old girl and a 5-year-old boy. So it's kind of tough, but to leave. But I would be interested in coaching a very high-level player that I feel like is worth my while, because for me, it's not about money anymore. I just like to do it right and do it well, and it's got to fit. You can't put a round peg in a square hole, and vice versa. So it's really something that has to be a convergence of effort and convergence of spirit and a convergence of ethics and all of those things. But I have had some interesting opportunities in the past, some that I would put in my book that I keep in my own mind. But there's some unbelievable stories about these coaches and what happens with some of these players that are at the very top. I mean, it's pretty hilarious.
So, Johan, you're looking at a lot of young kids now, and there seems to be a new generation coming out of the U.S. Do you see any players that are particularly promising that you think might be world beaters someday?
We've seen Tiafo came out the last 2 years. He's a big, strong kid, and he's got some funkiness about his serve and some of his movement. He's still young. I think he can probably get fitter and stronger, and he could be a contender. I don't think Donald Young is really much of a contender anymore, but he's a good player. Guy Fritz has come along. I remember his dad because he used to play pro tennis. There's always a younger generation coming up, and you never know who's going to pop out suddenly. There's quite a few young gals. I mean, Madison Keys is great. Sloane Stephens. Unfortunately, I think Sloane got injured now. But there's a cater of good American players for sure, and I think we're going to see over the next 10 or 15 years some Americans start to dominate again.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that the Europeans have really taken over the sport on the men's side, but in women's tennis, you still see there were 3 Americans. Obviously, 2 of them have been playing for a while, but there's 3 Americans in the semifinals of the Australian. Big contrast between the men's and women's tour.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the 2 Williams sisters. In fact, they live here in Palm Beach Gardens. They live in Ballina, which I'm literally 5 minutes away from there. But they've obviously just been incredible athletes and had amazing careers. I mean, just beyond belief what they've done, especially, I think, almost so much on par as Venus, because she came from where she came from with her illnesses and stuff, and to suddenly get to the finals at this age and what she's endured. And then you have, Serena Williams, which is just a complete anomaly, physical specimen on the women's side, who is extremely strong and has probably the best serve in women's tennis has ever had. And, she continues to win. And there's no reason why she can't win 2 more. Maybe not so much the French. I think that's a tough one for her. But I think Serena can definitely win Wimbledon and the US Open as well. But amazing. Pretty amazing.
Yeah, I mean, as an American football fan, I'm starting to see some of the top players play all the way up to the age of 40, and it looks like Serena could do that. Even Roger, maybe.
Well, this is amazing. I think Roger could be the next Ken Rosewell. I mean, he can play till he's 40.
All right, so we don't have to be alarmed that this is last Wimbledon. We were thinking of planning a trip.
I'm really hoping that Roger doesn't win anything at age 40, because otherwise my wife is going to say, "Get your lazy butt out of bed, go hit the gym. You are back on tour."
So we're coming to the pretty much to the end, but we wanted to ask you, what does a multiple Grand Slam winner do 25 years after they retire? You've started the academy. Can you tell us a little bit about what your vision is?
Yes, I have a tennis academy here, the Johan Kriek Tennis Academy here at PGA Resort and Spa in Palm Beach Gardens. I just signed an agreement with 10 Pro out of Holland, and we are going to joint venture on a very large junior tennis tournament on August 13th through the 19th here at Palm Beach Gardens, and it's going to be kids from all over the world. It's basically a compass draw. So if you're between the ages of 8 and 16, it doesn't matter how many enter. It's we have so many tennis courts around us here in Ballina and some other facilities that we can accommodate a very large group of kids, 300 to 500 kids playing in a tournament. So I'm very excited about that. But yeah, I mean, having an academy really is, for me, it's such a blessing, because I have had so much experience in my life. I made tennis almost entirely by myself, and so I am extremely self-reliant. So I have a tremendous knowledge of the game, and I'm very current. I've stayed very current all my life. I played almost 24 years professionally. I played 16 years ATP and 9 more years on a Champions Tour with poor Connors McEnroe. I was number 1 in singles and doubles. So, I've had a very keen understanding of the game for a very long time. And that golden era of playing with 4 different types of rackets, I think that's why we see so many of my era guys that are coaching top players today. So, because we have such a vivid understanding of the game, and we can change things up. We are a little bit more creative, perhaps. So, so for me to give back to the game of tennis is it's not even a job. I mean, for me, it's my life. Tennis has always been my life since I was 4 years old. I just didn't know it. And I'm still as excited every day to get up and go to do my job at the academy and see where it all goes. I mean, when I say I'm looking for the next Grand Slam champion, that's kind of like saying you're looking for a Roger Federer. No, everybody would obviously like to have somebody like that, but those types of things just happen so rarely, and it's so rarely that you find a Rafa. But then you have all these different flavors of people from all over the world. Some have been, like Andy Murray was coached by his mom, Jimmy Connors was coached by his mom, Pete Sampras was coached by a dentist. I mean, it's just amazing, all these different things that's happened in pro tennis. And for me, it's just, I love the sport, I love the history, I love the trivia, I love the craziness. It's a sport of a lifetime, and it teaches kids to be such good citizens. It's a sport that is so uniquely qualified for leadership and teaches you about self-reliance and life skills and how to deal with ups and downs. And, because 99% of the time you're probably going to lose a tournament, you're not going to win it, but you still come back and you think you can win it. So that's what makes tennis so uniquely qualified to be a lifetime sport.
Well, that's very inspiring, Johan. Thanks so much for talking to us.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this interview is gold for most of our audience, who would just love to listen to your views.
Yeah,
Once again, thanks for taking time.
Anytime, if you guys want to do something else sometime, just where I am. So I'm happy to do that. And send me a link so I can promote you guys as well.
Sure.